That structure is unpermitted, and the board has voted to have it condemned and removed at your expense by the end of the month. That was Diane Falk, president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association for 9 years running, standing at the foot of my porch steps on a Tuesday morning in a coral blazer and white sneakers that had never touched real dirt. The structure, she meant, was my cabin. The cabin my grandfather raised with his own hands in 1951, on 40 acres of pine slope that my family has held 3 generations longer than her subdivision has existed. She had a clipboard. She had a folder with the county seal photocopied onto the cover, which is not the same thing as the county seal. And she had no idea that the one document that mattered had been sitting in a fireproof box in my hall closet the whole time, signed and stamped and recorded before her HOA was a line on a plat. My name is Walt Mercer. I am 61 years old, and for 34 years I was a building inspector for this county, the man who read the codes other men argued about. What Diane did not know, standing on my steps that morning with her condemnation letter, was that I had personally signed off on the permit for the addition she was calling unpermitted. I had the carbon copy. I had the recorded plat. I had walked that property line with a transit before she ever bought her lot. So I want to ask you something, before I tell you how this went. If a woman in a coral blazer told you that the house your grandfather built was going to be torn down at your own expense, and you happened to be the one person in the county who knew exactly which records would prove her wrong, how long would you have let her keep talking? I let her keep talking a long time. That is the part I want you to understand first. I bought nothing on that slope. I inherited it. My grandfather, Tom Mercer, cut the first trees for the cabin in the spring of 1951, dragged the logs up with a borrowed mule, and set the foundation stones by hand along a granite shelf that has not moved an inch since. I have a photograph of him standing on that shelf with a maul over his shoulder, squinting into the sun, the cabin behind him only knee-high in courses of log. My father added the back room and the stone chimney in 1968. And he taught me to lay a level course of stone the summer I turned 12. And I can still hear him telling me that a wall is only as honest as the foundation under it. I added the workshop wing and the covered porch in 1994, the year my wife Carol and I moved up for good. And I pulled every permit for that work myself because I was, at the time, the county building inspector. And I was not about to be the inspector who skipped his own paperwork. Carol used to laugh about that. She said I filed the permits before I bought the lumber. She was not wrong. I framed the porch on weekends across that whole summer while she handed me boards and told me where the morning light would fall. And she was right about the light, the way she was right about most things. She passed 4 years ago, in the spring. After a long illness, she met with more steadiness than I had any right to expect from anybody. I buried her ashes under the lodgepole pine at the corner of the porch where she liked to drink her coffee, because that was the spot she always came back to. The one place on 40 acres she said felt like the exact center of our life. My daughter Nora moved up to live with me the year after, a sharp, careful 16-year-old who reminds me of her mother in the way she notices things and writes them down. She keeps a notebook in her back pocket the way her mother kept one by the stove. When something is bothering her, she does not say it. She writes it down first, reads it back, and then she tells you. And by then, it is usually right. I did not know yet how much that habit was going to matter. The Cedar Hollow subdivision went in along the bottom of our slope in 2004. A developer cleared the flat ground below the tree line, ran in roads and gas lines, and a row of beige houses with 2-car garages, and formed a homeowners association to manage the common areas, the entry gate, and the little man-made pond they called a lake. My 40 acres sit above all of it, on the original parcel, never subdivided, never annexed, never part of their plat. I am not a member of Cedar Hollow. I never signed a covenant. My driveway comes off the old county road on the far side of the ridge and does not touch their streets at all. For 16 years, that distinction did not matter to anybody, because for 16 years, nobody from the subdivision came up my hill. Then Diane Falk became president of the association. And a year after that, her husband Greg started a company called Falk Ridge Development. And the two facts turned out to be the same fact. The first letter came in the mail in the spring, a single sheet on association letterhead informing me that my property was in violation of community appearance standards because of, and I am quoting the letter, an accumulation of unapproved exterior storage. The accumulation was my firewood. 8 cords of split lodgepole stacked under the eave of the workshop, the way it has been stacked every year of my life, the way my father stacked it and his father before him, bark side up so the rain sheds off it, the most ordinary sight on any mountain property in the county. I read the letter twice, standing at the mailbox, and then I read it a third time at the kitchen table, because I wanted to be sure I was not missing some legitimate authority hidden in the bureaucratic phrasing. There was none. The association had no more right to regulate my firewood than my firewood had to regulate the association. I set the letter on the table, smoothed it flat with my hand, and I started a folder. A plain manila folder labeled in pencil, Cedar Hollow. That was the founding of the binder, though I did not call it a binder yet. I had kept records for 34 years for a living, every inspection, every variance, every appeal, filed and dated and cross-referenced, so that any one of them could be found in under a minute 3 years later. I did not stop the day I retired. A habit like that does not retire when the man does. I drove down to the association office the next morning, which was a converted garage at the front of the subdivision with a window air conditioner and a folding table for a front desk. And I told the woman sitting there, politely, with my hat in my hand, that my parcel was not within the association boundary and that I would be glad to bring down the recorded plat and show her exactly where the line ran. She did not look up from her screen for long. She said she would pass it along to the board. I asked who on the board I should follow up with, and she said Mrs. Falk handled compliance personally, and the way she said personally told me more than she meant it to. 2 weeks later, a second letter came, this one adding a daily fine of $50, retroactive to the date of the first notice, which meant they were charging me for the 2 weeks during which I had driven down in good faith to explain that they had the wrong parcel. That was Incident 2. I filed it behind Incident 1, dated the tab, and felt something settle in me that I recognized from my working years. It was the feeling of a case beginning to take a shape that the other side could not see yet. I want to be honest about the temptation. There is a kind of man who would have driven down there and put the plat on the desk and made the woman read it out loud. I was tempted to be that man. I had spent 3 decades watching people lose winnable cases because they got loud before they got documented, and I knew something Diane did not. I knew that a fine the association had no jurisdiction to levy was worth more to me on paper than off it. Every illegitimate notice she sent was a brick in a wall she was building around herself. So I did not argue. I filed. The fines accumulated through the summer. By August, the association's running total, by their own arithmetic, had reached $4,200. I had not paid a cent, and I never would, because they could not lawfully charge me a cent. I photographed every notice, logged the date and time it arrived, and saved each one in the folder. Nora started helping me. She set up a spreadsheet on the kitchen laptop with columns for date, type of contact, and a running count. She liked the count. She said it made the whole thing feel less like a hornet's nest and more like a ledger, and she was right. The first time we hit double digits, she turned the laptop around to show me. 11 contacts. 11 she said, and tapped the screen. The escalation widened in the fall. On a Thursday morning in October, a man in a blue polo with a laminated badge on a lanyard came up my driveway in a white pickup and announced he was there for a compliance inspection. He had the walk of a man who had been told he had authority and had not yet been corrected. I came down off the porch with my coffee and asked to see his credentials. He held up the lanyard like it answered the question. The badge said Cedar Hollow Code Enforcement, which is a title that does not exist, because a homeowners association is not a code enforcement agency and cannot deputize one. And I had spent 34 years being the actual thing that badge was pretending to be. I told him, level, that he was standing on private property outside the association boundary, that there was no such office as Cedar Hollow Code Enforcement, and that I would be glad to call the actual county building department if he wanted to meet an actual inspector. He blinked at that. He said Mrs. Falk had sent him. I said I did not doubt it. He left. What he did before he left changed how I understood the whole year. He stood at the bottom of my porch steps, the same steps Diane had stood on, raised his phone, and took photographs of my cabin, slow and deliberate, turning his body to frame each shot. He was not photographing the firewood. He stepped around it to get a clean angle past it. He photographed the workshop wing and the covered porch and the joint where the new construction met the old logs, the parts of the cabin that were newest and largest and most valuable, the parts a developer would need to document if he were building a case that a structure should be removed rather than merely cleaned up. I watched him do it, and I did not say a word, because a man documenting his own intentions in front of you is doing you a favor, and you do not interrupt a man who is doing you a favor. I went inside, wrote down the time, the make of the truck, the text on the fake badge, and what he had photographed and in what order. I filed the visit. Incident 14. That was the first time I understood the firewood had never been the point. I called an old colleague that night, a surveyor named Hank Ostrander, who had run boundaries for the county for as long as I had read plans. Retired now and keeping bees on the other side of the ridge. We had walked 100 property lines together over the years, him on the transit and me with the code book, and there was nobody whose read on a parcel I trusted more. I asked him what he knew about Falk Ridge development. The line went quiet long enough that I could hear his clock ticking. Then he said the company had filed a preliminary plat with the county planning office for an expansion of Cedar Hollow, 40 new lots stepping up the slope above the existing subdivision, and that the slope above the existing subdivision was, give or take a property line, my 40 acres. They cannot plat what they do not own, I said. Hank said no, they cannot. And then he said the thing that made me pull out a chair and sit down at the kitchen table. He said the preliminary plat showed my parcel inside the development boundary, labeled as available for acquisition, with a note that the existing structure was to be removed. He said he had seen it with his own eyes at the planning counter, because an old surveyor cannot help reading other men's plats, and he had recognized the Mercer line the second he saw it, and he had wondered when I was going to call. To be removed. The same 2 words Diane had used standing on my porch. The condemnation letter was not about appearance standards, and it had never been about my firewood. It was about clearing my grandfather's cabin off a slope that Greg Falk needed in order to subdivide and sell 40 lots. And the appearance violations were nothing more than the paper trail a developer builds when he wants a structure declared a nuisance before he makes an offer nobody intends to honor. I thanked Hank, and before I hung up, I asked him one more thing. I asked whether the original Mercer plat was still on file at the recorder, clean and certified. He laughed, the dry laugh of a man who has filed 10,000 documents. He said it was right where his predecessor had recorded it in 1949, and that a parcel surveyed and recorded that long ago, never subdivided, never annexed, was about the most bulletproof thing a man could own in this county. "Pull it," he said. "Pull all of it. Then sit on your hands until they put themselves somewhere a judge can see them." I did not call Diane. I did not call Greg. I filed Hank's information, dated it, and added a new section to the folder labeled Motive. And then I did the most important thing I did in this entire affair, which was nothing visible at all. I went down to the county recorder's office the next morning, and I pulled certified copies of 3 documents. The recorded plat of the original Mercer parcel, surveyed and filed in 1949, 2 years before the cabin was even built. The deed, recorded the same year, describing the 40 acres by meets and bounds with my family's name on it, and the building permit for my 1994 addition, permit number on file, signed by the inspector of record. The inspector of record was me. I held the certified copy in the parking lot for a long minute, looking at my own signature on the permit that Diane Falk was telling the county did not exist. And I will admit, there was a satisfaction in it that I had to set down before I drove home. Because satisfaction makes a man talk, and I was not ready to talk. I put all 3 in the fireproof box, and I waited because I knew that the case was not yet ripe. Diane had escalated through fines and a fake inspector, but she had not yet done anything she could not walk back. I needed her fully committed to the position that my cabin was unpermitted and within her jurisdiction. I needed her on the record, and Diane, being Diane, was more than happy to oblige. The day and time stamps in my folder tell the story of that winter better than I can. Monday the 9th, 9:40 a.m. A certified letter demanding access for a structural assessment. Wednesday the 18th, 2 p.m. A notice that the association had retained counsel. Friday the 27th, 11 a.m. A phone call from a lawyer named Pruitt informing me that the association intended to pursue removal of the non-compliant structure through, his words, all available legal channels. I told Mr. Pruitt that I welcomed any legal channel he cared to use and that I would be keeping a record of our conversation. And I heard him pause. Because lawyers understand that sentence in a way most people do not. I filed the call. Incident 22. Nora was in the room for that one. When I hung up, she asked if we were going to be okay. And I told her the truth, which was that we were going to be better than okay. But that I needed her to do something hard, which was to keep being patient while it looked like we were losing. She thought about that. Then she said she would keep the count. She was good to her word. She kept the count all the way to the end. The thing I had to be careful about that winter was that the law did not care that I was right until I made it care. In the right room, at the right time. A filed complaint gets acted on regardless of merit. A deputy told me that, in those words, in February. His name was Ray Coons, a county sheriff's deputy who came up my driveway on a cold morning, his breath showing, because the association had filed a report claiming I was harassing their inspectors. I was not. I had told one man to leave my property, which I am allowed to do. But the complaint existed, so Ray had to come ask about it. He was apologetic and professional about it from the first word. He stood on my porch with his hands tucked into his jacket against the cold and explained that he had no choice but to log the contact. That a complaint does not have to be true to require a response, and that the worst thing I could do was lose my temper about it. Because a lost temper is the one thing that turns a baseless complaint into a real one. I told him I had no intention of losing my temper, and I asked him what a man in my position was supposed to do. That was when he told me the thing that organized the rest of the year for me. He said if I believed the underlying dispute was civil, which it plainly was, The thing to do was build a documented pattern and bring it somewhere it could be ruled on. He told me a number. He said if I could show a sustained pattern of unfounded complaints, say 30 or more over a year, a pattern any reasonable person could lay eyes on and count, that changed the picture for everybody who had to keep driving up here to respond to them. A pattern, he said, is just a fact that has happened enough times to be undeniable. Then he stopped, and he looked past me at the cabin, at the stone chimney my father laid in 1968, and his face changed. He said his own grandfather had built a place like it up the next valley, log on a stone foundation, and that they had lost it to a tax sale in the bad years, and that he hoped this one worked out different. I told him it would. He nodded like he wanted to believe me and walked back to his cruiser. I filed the visit, Incident 29. I filed Ray differently, though. I filed him under the heading of a man who would recognize the truth the moment it was put in front of him, which is the only kind of officer this story has, and the only kind it needs. The pattern Ray described was exactly the pattern I had been building since the first letter about my firewood. I just needed the venue. And the venue, it turned out, was coming to me, because Falk Ridge Development could not break ground on its expansion without approval from the County Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission held public hearings. And a public hearing is a room with a neutral authority, a court reporter, and an open microphone. It is, in other words, the best room in the world to produce a document. The hearing was set for a Tuesday evening in the spring, almost exactly a year after Diane first stood on my porch. The agenda item was the preliminary plat for the Cedar Hollow expansion, 40 new lots, and the staff report attached to the agenda described the project boundary in language I recognized, because it was the language from the plat Hank had warned me about. My parcel, inside their line, labeled available for acquisition, existing structure to be removed. They had put it in writing, in a public document, filed with the county. That was the brick that finished the wall. I made copies. I made a clean set of the 3 certified documents from the recorder, and I made a separate folder of the year of association correspondence. Every fine, every fake inspector, every lawyer's letter, organized by date with Nora's count printed on the cover sheet. 41 contacts over 13 months. I did not plan to give a speech. I had learned a long time ago that the document does the talking, and that a man who lets the paper speak looks like a man who is sure, while a man who shouts looks like a man who is hoping. The night before the hearing, Nora and I sat at the kitchen table and went through the folder one more time. The whole year laid out in tabs and dated photographs and her printed spreadsheet on top. She had a question she had been holding for a while, the kind she writes down before she asks. She asked why I had let it go on so long, why I had taken a year of fines and lawyers and a stranger photographing our house when I could have ended it the first morning by walking down the hill and laying the plat on the folding table in front of Diane Falk. I told her that if I had shown the plat that first morning, Diane would have apologized, withdrawn the letter, smiled, and waited 6 months to come at us a different way, quieter, harder to catch, with the firewood replaced by a setback dispute or an easement claim or a noise complaint, something with just enough color of legitimacy to drag us into a real fight on her terms instead of mine. By letting her build the whole staircase, step by step, in her own hand. I had let her commit every step of it to the public record, where it could not be walked back, in front of the one body in the county that could not only protect the cabin, but stop the development the cabin was standing in the way of. The plat would not just save the cabin, I told her. It would take the legs out from under the expansion, because the expansion needed my slope, and the slope was never theirs to need. Nora looked at the folder for a long time, turning the cover sheet with her count on it. Then she said, slow, working it out the way her mother used to. So the firewood letter is going to flood their whole subdivision. I asked her what she meant by that, because I had not yet said the part about the drainage out loud to anybody. And she said she had read the staff report on the county website, the one with the stormwater plan, and that the plan ran all its water across the parcel they thought they were going to get. If they do not get the parcel, she said, the water does not have anywhere to go. I sat there and looked at my 16-year-old daughter, who had read a county stormwater plan for fun. And I thought about her mother handing me boards on the porch and telling me where the light would fall. And I told Nora she was exactly right, and that I had been about to explain that very thing, and that I was glad I did not have to. She wrote something in her notebook and did not show me what it was. The county hearing room was a low brick building next to the courthouse, fluorescent lit, with rows of folding chairs and a raised dais where the 5 planning commissioners sat behind nameplates. Greg Falk was there in a gray suit with a roll of architectural drawings under his arm. Diane was beside him in a magenta blazer and pearls, and she had brought the same clipboard, as if a clipboard had ever helped anyone in that room. Their lawyer Pruitt sat at the applicant's table. Behind them sat maybe 30 residents of Cedar Hollow, some of them my neighbors at the bottom of the hill. Ordinary people who had been told by their own association that the stubborn holdout on the slope was driving up everyone's dues with his refusal to comply, and a few of them would not meet my eye. Ray Coons was there too, in uniform, standing at the back near the door, because deputies sometimes draw the duty of keeping order at contentious hearings, and word had gotten around that this one would be. The planning staff presented first. The expansion looked clean on the slides, 40 lots, new roads, a stormwater plan, until the chairwoman, a commissioner named Pat Lindqvist, asked the question that planning chairs are paid to ask. She asked whether the applicant had clear title or purchase agreement for every parcel inside the project boundary, because the boundary appeared to include land not owned by the developer. Greg stood and said acquisition of the final parcel was in progress and that the current structure on it was an unpermitted, non-conforming building scheduled for removal, which would not affect the project timeline. Diane stood up beside him, uninvited, and said into the room that the parcel in question was functionally part of the Cedar Hollow community and had been out of compliance for over a year with more than 40 documented violations, and that the association fully supported its removal. She said the word removal the way you would say a chore you were tired of. 40 documented violations. She had just told a public body, on the record, with a court reporter typing, that she had counted them. That was my cue. There is a portion of every planning hearing for public comment, and when the chairwoman opened it, I walked to the microphone with my folder. I did not raise my voice. I said my name, and I said I owned the parcel the applicant had labeled available for acquisition, and that I had 3 documents for the commission and the court reporter. I laid the first one on the table where the staff could reach it. The recorded plat of the Mercer parcel, surveyed and filed in 1949. I laid down the second. The deed, recorded the same year. My family's name in the metis and bounds. And I laid down the third, and I said only what it was, because it was the one that mattered. A county building permit for the addition to the structure, issued in 1994, signed by the inspector of record. Then I said the last thing I said that night. I said, the inspector of record was me. I held that office for 34 years. I signed that permit before I retired, and it has been recorded in your office the entire time the association has been calling the structure unpermitted. The room did the thing rooms do when a fact lands. It went quiet. Pat Lindqvist took the certified permit from the staff and read the permit number. And then she read the signature. And then she looked up. Not at me, but at Greg Falk and at Diane. And the look on her face was not anger. It was the flat, tired recognition of a public official who has just watched an applicant assert in a public hearing the opposite of a recorded fact. She asked the staff to confirm the parcel against the county recorder. The staff member already had it on his screen. He said the parcel was a separate legal lot of record, never annexed into Cedar Hollow, with the deed and plat exactly as I had described, and the permit valid and on file. He said it quietly, the way you confirm something everyone in the room already understands. Diane started to speak. She said something about community standards, about the spirit of the covenant, about how the parcel was functionally within their jurisdiction. The chairwoman cut her off, not unkindly, and told her that functionally was not a category the commission recognized, that the parcel was either inside the legal boundary or it was not, and that it was not. Greg sat down. The roll of drawing stayed rolled. Here's the pair of numbers I want you to hold, because the whole year came down to them. The deed to my parcel was recorded in 1949, 75 years before that hearing, 2 years before the cabin it protected even existed. The association's claim against it rested on 41 notices sent over 13 months, not one of which they had legal authority to send, and $0 of which they had ever lawfully collected. 75 years against 13 months. A recorded deed against a stack of letters. That is not a close case. It only looked close because I let it look close for a year, while the other side committed everything they had to the wrong side of it. The proportionate part, the part Nora had seen coming at the kitchen table, took a few more weeks to arrive. And it arrived because of the development, not because of anything I did. With my parcel confirmed as a separate lot the developer did not own, the project boundary no longer closed. The 40-lot expansion had been engineered with my slope as its upper edge, and the stormwater plan, the drainage that was supposed to carry runoff away from the new houses, had been designed to flow across the parcel they assumed they would acquire. Without it, the plan did not drain. The commission denied the preliminary plat and sent the application back for a complete redesign. And the county engineer's review flagged that the existing Cedar Hollow subdivision, the one Greg had already built, had been relying on an undersized drainage easement that the expansion was meant to fix. The fix was gone. The next heavy spring rain put 2 inches of standing water in the streets at the bottom of the hill. The streets where the residents who had been told I was the problem actually lived. The flood Diane had aimed at my grandfather's cabin landed on her own subdivision. I did not cause that. The slope did, the way the slope always would have, the way the original surveyor knew it would when he drew the line in 1949 and kept the high ground a separate parcel. The consequences for the Falks were not dramatic. And I want to be honest that I never wanted them to be. There was no perp walk, no shouting, nobody led away in handcuffs. The consequence was simpler and heavier than that. Diane was not re-elected president that year, voted out by the same residents she had told for a year that I was the problem. Once they stood in 2 inches of water in their own streets and started asking where the drainage plan had gone. The association, facing a stormwater repair it had never budgeted for and could not afford, opened its books to a forensic review, and the review turned up the thousands of dollars in legal fees the board had quietly spent chasing a parcel it had no jurisdiction over, money that had come out of every member's dues. Greg's company withdrew the expansion application, and the last I heard, he had been named in a suit by his own homeowners over the flooding, which is a particular kind of ending for a developer, to be sued by the very people he built for. The thing they tried to take, my slope, became the exact thing that exposed them, And it did so for one reason only, which is that they had committed it to the public record in their own words before they ever checked whether the record could bear it. A board member named Susan Hale closed the last of it. She had voted against the condemnation from the start, the lone no on a 9-to-1 board, and she had done the thing I respect most, which is that she had kept her own notes, dated and detailed, the whole time. When the forensic reviewer came, she handed those notes over and gave a statement about how the votes had been pushed through, how Diane had presented the parcel as a sure acquisition, how the legal fees had been authorized without the membership ever being told what they were for. That statement did more damage than anything I ever said in that hearing room, because it came from inside, from someone with nothing to gain. And there is no answer to that kind of witness. I never met Susan Hale until it was over. When I did, she said she had wanted to call me a dozen times that year and had been afraid to. I told her she had done the right thing in the right place, which is all any of us can do, and that her notebook had been worth more than my whole binder, because mine proved I was right, and hers proved they knew it. Ray Coons came up my driveway one more time that spring, off duty, in his own truck, and he stood on the porch where Diane had stood and where the fake inspector had stood, and he looked at the cabin for a while. He said the county had closed every complaint against me, all 41, marked unfounded. He said it the way a man hands back something that was never yours to begin with, but got taken anyway. Then he accepted a cup of coffee, and we talked about his grandfather's place up the valley. And that was the end of his part in it. Nora is the one who closed it out, in the way that mattered to me. On a clear evening in early summer, she carried 2 mugs of coffee out to the corner of the porch, to the lodgepole pine where her mother's ashes are, the spot where Carol used to sit, and she set one mug down on the rail like she always does, for her mom, the way the 2 of them did it. She sat in the other chair. The slope went gold the way it does at that hour, the pines my grandfather left standing when he cut the ones for the cabin, the granite shelf that has not moved since 1951. She said the count was at 41, and it was never going up again. Then she said she was glad we kept the records. So was I. The cabin was still standing. The deed was still recorded. The promise my family made to that slope, 3 generations deep, was still kept. That is where the story ends. But it is not where the lesson ends. So let me step out of it for a moment and tell you plainly what I want you to take from a year of my life. If anybody with a clipboard and a letterhead tells you that the thing your family built is out of compliance, do not argue with them on your porch. Go to your county recorder's office and pull the certified copy of your deed and the recorded plat of your parcel, and read the legal description against the ground until you know exactly where your line is. If you have ever done work on your home, find the permit. And if you cannot find it, the county has it. And a certified copy costs a few dollars and outweighs a year of angry letters. Keep a folder. Date everything. Photograph every notice and log every visit, because a pattern you can count is a pattern a neutral authority can act on. And an authority that has to respond to a complaint is the same authority that will recognize a deed the moment you put it in front of them in the right room. Do not pay a fine to an entity that has no jurisdiction to levy it. But do not refuse it loudly either. File it. Let them build the staircase. The patient record beats the loud complaint every single time, because the universe is slow, but it is just to the people who keep the paper. If you have got a story like this one, a fence, a gate, a deed, a board that forgot to read it, put it in the comments, because I read them, and because somebody else needs to hear that they are not crazy and not alone. If this helped you, subscribe, and I will keep telling them. Next time, I will tell you about the widow 2 valleys over whose HOA tried to charge her for a private road the county had maintained for 40 years, and the single canceled check that ended it. Until then, walk your lines, pull your records, and keep your folder. I am Walt Mercer. Thanks for sitting with me.